Charles Bonnet Syndrome is a common condition among people who've lost their sight. It causes people who have lost a lot of vision to see things that aren't there. Medically known as having a hallucination, this condition is more common than one may think, with an estimated half of individuals experiencing visual hallucinations due to gradual loss of vision during their lifetime. However, most people are likely unfamiliar with this condition. The lack of awareness is primarily because many sufferers, including himself, are afraid to share their experiences with others. His name is Xavier and he is 25 years old. 2 years ago, he woke up with a severely blurred vision where every edge and detail appeared clouded as if someone had smeared Vaseline on a camera lens. Unfortunately, this condition did not improve over time. He was terrified and immediately rushed to see Dr. Moore, opting to take a cab instead of driving his car, which he had safely operated for 3 years before this incident. After running a series of tests and asking him a series of questions about his recent increase in thirst, frequency of urination and fatigue levels, the doctor delivered the life-changing diagnosis: diabetes, specifically type. The doctor explained that he would now need to administer insulin shots with every meal and that he would need to closely monitor his blood sugar levels to avoid going into a coma or experiencing even worse consequences from consuming the wrong foods. Following the discussion about his treatment plan, the doctor then turned his attention to his eyes, informing him that his diabetes had caused maculopathy. In a state of shock from the diagnosis, he shook his head in confusion and listened as Dr. Moore further explained the condition. It is when diabetes affects the blood vessels in the back of the eye, causing them to become blocked and leak into the macula, the central part of the retina responsible for color perception and fine detail. This leakage can cause significant harm. With a lump in his throat, he asked if there was a way to improve the situation. Although he couldn't see Moore's face clearly, his tone conveyed the news he had dreaded. "I'm sorry, Xavier," he said solemnly. "If we had caught this earlier, there might have been some treatment options. Unfortunately, the damage is quite extensive. We can take steps to halt the progression of the condition, but it cannot be reversed." It felt like his whole world had collapsed. At just 25, he was at his physical peak, actively involved in basketball and cycling several times a week. But suddenly, his health, body and vision were cruelly taken away from him. The first half year was incredibly challenging. He ended his relationship with Daisy, a kind-hearted girl who tried her best to make it work, but he was constantly filled with anger. He lost his job because as a painter, one's eyesight is crucial. He even distanced himself from many of his friends, making excuses to avoid seeing them until they eventually stopped asking. In reality, it was pure jealousy on his part, as he envied their ability to continue living their lives while everything he had ever dreamed of was snatched away. He isolated himself completely, never stepping foot outside his apartment, neglecting basic personal hygiene and dressing poorly each day. He believed his life was finished and stopped making any effort to live it. It took a while, but eventually, a nurse named Sierra, who was experienced and straightforward, made him realize something important. "You're a terrible person," she bluntly told. Shocked by her language, he exclaimed. She continued without waiting for his response. "You have diabetes, but do you know how many other people do too? Do you think they all locked themselves away and refused to move forward? Losing your vision is undoubtedly difficult, and he sympathizes with Xavier, but that is no excuse to give up." Trying to defend himself, he started, "But you don't." Interrupting me, she snapped "Let me tell you about one of the bravest men I know. He was paralyzed from the neck down as a child, and he never gave up. You have so much potential in your life, and people are willing to support you, yet you can't even put in the effort to shave that awful beard off. Stop being so weak and make a real difference." It didn't happen instantly, and he disputed with her. He was extremely angry at her direct lack of sensitivity and instructed her to leave. He declared that he would inform her superiors, but she chuckled and told him it wouldn't happen. "You won't because you're intelligent and have too much pride for that," she said confidently. "I'll see you next week." That night he shaved. He drew back the curtains and truly observed his surroundings. Although things were unclear, he could make out the objects scattered throughout his messy home that he had neglected. When Sierra returned the following week, everything was organized. He was clean-shaven, dressed up, and even tried to comb his hair. She didn't mention anything about their previous argument and simply took him out for coffee nearby. She guided him along the sidewalk, comforting and reassuring him. It was overwhelming, even though the coffee shop was just a short walk away. However, he felt an immense sense of pride when they arrived. He and Sierra had a conversation, and he may have even found it amusing. Later on, she walked him back home, and when she helped him get inside, she finally said, "It's nice to finally meet you, Xavier." That day marked the start of a new chapter in his life. He relocated to a new ground-floor apartment and joined a group of other young individuals who also had visual impairments. He made friends and made it a priority to go out every day, even if it was just for a short stroll, to explore the world to the best of his abilities. He purchased what he could, but the local store owners, the Sawyers, kindly delivered his groceries once a week. Enzo, who is an old and gruff individual, refuses to treat him with kid gloves. He has expressed his admiration for him for accepting himself as he is and for maintaining his independence without giving up. That is one of the most heartwarming things he has ever heard coming from someone like him. Everything was going perfectly fine, until 1 year ago when it all started. He entered his living room, holding a mug of coffee, and to his surprise, there was a Victorian hearse standing right there on his rug. It had 2 enormous, majestic horses, adorned with long black plumes in their bridles, and a driver dressed in period attire with a top hat, anxiously holding the reins and looking at him with anticipation. Strangely enough, they were much clearer and more defined than the usual blurry shapes he could perceive. He was so terrified that he nearly wet himself. In his panic, he accidentally dropped the cup, spilling scorching hot coffee on his bare feet, causing him to jump back in pain and alarm. However, when he refocused his attention on the horses and carriage in the room, they had vanished. He questioned his sanity in that instance. This is a common reaction, which is reasonable. How would you react if you witnessed an identical scene in your own home? After a considerable amount of silently swearing to himself and attempting to deceive himself, he eventually convinced himself that what he had seen was not real, but rather a vivid daydream. This technique appeared to be effective, and he continued with his daily life, although he entered that particular room with a slightly more cautious approach in the ensuing days. Eventually, he stopped thinking about it altogether. However, 2 weeks later, he observed a massive, levitating, twirling orange sphere in his bathroom. He was so scared that he almost peed himself once more. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw it, a strange globe floating and spinning above his bathtub. It was bigger than a beach ball and seemed unreal. He stood there transfixed for about 10 seconds before closing his eyes tightly and repeating to himself, "That's not real. That's not real." After a few seconds, he reopened his eyes and the globe had vanished. Have you ever questioned your mental stability? Have you ever doubted if what you see is truly there or just a product of your imagination? To be honest, The thought of losing his sanity was much more terrifying to him than the possibility of losing his eyesight. He had always prided himself on overcoming challenges and living his own life. But how could he continue to do that if he lost his mental faculties? That night, he could barely sleep, and for days afterward, he was constantly on edge. Every slight movement or unfamiliar shape had his heart racing and made him question if it was even real. This was the most difficult period he had ever experienced, even worse than when he was diagnosed with diabetes. At least back then, when Dr. Moore gave him the news, he had a clear understanding of his condition. It was a physical ailment with a name, and there was a treatment plan in place. This was a unique experience. His thoughts had turned against him, distorting his perception of reality and making it unreliable. It is only when you are in that situation that you realize how frightening it can be. Your senses and your brain's interpretation of them are your only genuine defenses against harm. They warn you of danger and help you avoid it, keeping your body safe. But what happens when you can't rely on your perception to alert you to real dangers? Sierra was the first to notice something was off. Observing his nervous behavior, she inquired about what was troubling him and if he needed to talk, but he assured her that he was okay, just struggling with sleep. It was indeed true that he hadn't been able to sleep at all. The thought of being institutionalized was terrifying. The idea of spending the rest of his life sedated, wearing blue pajamas, trapped in a white room with only the sound of his fellow inmates' cries was beyond frightening. However, he had to consider the alternative, living a life where he posed a risk to himself and others. In the end, he decided to ignore the possibility of being institutionalized. He convinced himself that as long as he could function around others without them realizing what was going on, that would be enough. A month went by without any incidents, and he genuinely believed that maybe he had left this whole ordeal behind him. With each passing day, his confidence grew, to the point where on that sunny Wednesday morning, he stepped out onto the street feeling carefree. Every Wednesday, he had a delightful routine of going to Ben's coffee shop for a latte, a tradition that started when he used to go there with Sierra. He found a lot of joy in this habit, as it allowed him to form friendships with other regular customers and even the staff, including Ben himself. On his way to the coffee shop, he walked down the street with his white walking stick, observing the vibrant colors and intriguing shapes of the world around him. The sun's warmth on his face and the melodic songs of the birds added to the pleasant ambience of the day. However, his attention was suddenly captured by the sight of 6 pilgrims sitting on the ground, all dressed in historical clothing reminiscent of the settler era. They were engrossed in a spirited conversation, but oddly enough, it was completely silent. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed on them. Despite their furious gestures and evident anger, he couldn't hear a word they were saying. The intense volume of their voices indicated that they must be yelling at each other. Overwhelmed by shock, he lost control of his body, causing the white stick to slip from his numb grip and crash onto the pavement. He turned to escape the distressing sight of the quarreling colonists, but his panic and haste led him to unintentionally step on his cane. It rolled beneath his feet, causing him to lose balance and fall hard onto the unforgiving ground. In his attempt to protect himself, he couldn't react quickly enough and ended up bruising his cheek and scraping his palms. After hearing a cry, a concerned woman came to his aid and helped him up. She noticed that his cheek was bleeding and applied a Kleenex to it. Although he tried to reassure her that he was fine, she insisted on taking him to Dawn Moore's office to have his injuries checked. Looking back, he believed she knew that his distress stemmed from something more than just the fall. Initially, He was embarrassed and angry, but now he realizes that he owes her a great deal of gratitude. Without her help, I'm not sure how much longer he could have endured the mounting stress before completely breaking down and possibly ending up in a mental institution. As D'Amour cleaned his cheek, he kindly asked him to explain what had happened. He admitted to him that he had recently lost his balance and tried to convince him that everything was fine. However, he seemed to see through his weak excuses and could sense his inner stress. Rather than pushing him further, he asked what could have caused his clumsiness and how he had been doing lately. After stumbling through a vague response, he comfortingly placed his hand on his shoulder and gently urged him to confide in him about what had truly happened. He started sobbing and expressed his fear to him, explaining how he had worked hard for his independence, only to have it ripped away from him. He patiently listened and then questioned why he believed that. This made him pause, take a deep breath, and consider his options. He shared everything with him: the horse and carriage, the orange globe, and the pilgrims. He admitted to living in constant fear, terrified that he was losing his sanity. After contemplating for a while, Dr. Moore reassured me, saying, "Xavier, I don't believe you are going insane." The relief he felt at that moment was so overwhelming that it left him speechless. "So, you're saying that despite witnessing these events, you haven't heard any sounds coming from them? Have you noticed any smells or felt any physical sensations, like touching them?" He shook his head in response, and he gently patted his shoulder again. "Xavier, are you familiar with Charles Bonnet Syndrome?" he inquired. "Charles Bonnet, what?" he responded, taken aback by this abrupt change in topic. Dr. Moore explained that Charles Bonnet was a Swiss naturalist who lived in the 1700s and observed a peculiar condition in his blind, elderly grandfather. Despite suffering from cataracts, the old man had regular visual hallucinations, such as random patterns and even people and places. Dr. Moore asked if this sounded familiar to him, and he worriedly questioned if he was experiencing Dr. Moore calmed him down, saying, "Xavier, don't worry. Let me explain how perception works. In simple terms, your eyes collect light through the iris and pupil. This light is then processed by the retina and converted into electrical signals. The brain decodes these signals and arranges them to form a familiar image. Following along?" He nodded, finally grasping the concept. Dr. Moore explained that when the retina is impaired due to conditions like macular degeneration, the signals it sends to the brain get distorted and mixed up. Despite this, the brain still receives these signals and tries to interpret them to form an image. In doing so, it may fill in missing information with colors, patterns, creatures, and even places that do not exist. This phenomenon is known as Charles Bonnet Syndrome. Feeling a sense of relief, he tearfully exclaimed that he was not losing his sanity. "Not at all," the doctor responded. "This is a purely physical condition. Your mental health is fully intact. If you had any form of psychiatric illness, your delusions wouldn't be limited to just one sense. You would hear, smell, and even feel these intrusions. This condition is solely connected to your eyes, not your brain." After leaving D'Amour's office, he felt as if a burden had been lifted. Although his vision remained problematic, knowing it was an issue with his eyes rather than his mind gave him the confidence to confront the situation. He was prepared to face the world again. Since then, he has witnessed numerous peculiar visual experiences. One example is spotting a magnificent waterfall in the park, surrounded by a misty haze and colourful butterflies fluttering around it. At the coffee shop, he witnessed a Native American warrior wearing a large feather headdress, sitting on a stool at the counter. Later, he noticed an elaborate set of scaffolding covering his entire apartment building, which seemed impossible. On the 4th of July last year, there was even a magnificent green dragon soaring and twirling through the sky. Initially, these sightings appeared real and disconcerting, but once he recognized them as optical illusions, they became enjoyable and fascinating spectacles, almost like personal art shows. He grew to appreciate and anticipate unexpectedly. 1 month ago, he laid eyes on her. Every time he sees her, it's always night time. On this particular occasion, he was preparing for bed when he entered the kitchen to fetch a glass of water. Suddenly, he let out a cry of alarm as he noticed a figure lurking in the corner. This woman was incredibly tall, taller than anyone he had ever encountered, even though she stood hunched over, as he was accustomed to encountering eccentric individuals donning peculiar attire. This was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her outfit seemed to be a strange amalgamation from various periods, rather than belonging to a specific era. She wore a form-fitting black tuxedo jacket designed for a female figure, paired with an old and disheveled ruffled. To complete this unusual ensemble, she sported a vibrant red bow tie. On her hands, which she held out as though shrugging or searching for something in the air, she donned grimy white gloves. Her fingers were unnaturally long, almost resembling the limbs of a spider, and they occasionally trembled as if longing to grasp and squeeze something tightly. Dressed in shorts the same shade of red as her bow tie, she paired them with black stockings, showcasing her long, slender legs that possessed an attractive and graceful appearance, reminiscent of a dancer. Complementing her ensemble were red heels, which gleamed and glistened, evoking thoughts of Judy Garland's famous ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. Despite the peculiarity of her attire, his attention remained fixated on her face, although a significant portion of it was concealed by a tilted and playful bowler hat. Her deathly pale complexion and a grin that sent shivers down his spine peeked out from beneath the hat's brim. Her smile, which should have exuded warmth and geniality, instead emanated wickedness, similar to the gleeful satisfaction he would anticipate from a snake approaching its prey. What surprised him the most was the presence of an additional arm on her back, coiled like a scorpion's tail above her head. This arm was longer than usual and had a hand with only 3 fingers, resembling a claw. It was pointed directly towards him, following his movements as he stumbled in shock and disbelief. For a few moments, he stood there, trying to comprehend what he was witnessing. The figure stood in the corner, smiling sinisterly at him. Eventually, he realized that this was just another hallucination, bringing a sense of relief that was audible in his sigh. Having dealt with Charles Bonnet Syndrome for several months, he developed a technique to disrupt the line of vision, causing his brain to interpret the images as hallucinations. It's similar to restarting a malfunctioning computer, how refreshing the system debugs it. To make the hallucination disappear, he closed his eyes and counted to 5. Upon reopening them, the terrifying, deformed figure in his kitchen would be gone. Therefore, faced with this horrifying sight, he knew that all he needed to do was shut his eyes to make the image vanish. To be honest, when he reached the count of 5, he hesitated a bit before opening his eyes. If he had opened them and found her still standing there, smiling that malicious smile at me, he thought he would have had a heart attack. Luckily, she was not there, and he let out a relieved sigh, grabbed a glass of water, and returned to bed. In the days that followed, he couldn't stop thinking about the tall woman. She was different from the other apparitions he had encountered. There was something about her that felt more tangible, more real. His friend Owen noticed his unease when they met for lunch the following Friday. Owen was one of those friends he had tried to push away after losing his sight, but he refused to give up on him. He kept reaching out to him week after week, True friends are hard to come by, but amazing friends. The ones who will be with you for life are even rarer. Owen, with his kind heart, is one of those rare gems. Dude, you have to tell me what's going on. He insisted as we sat down for our pizza. He inquired, "What do you mean?" In an attempt to downplay the situation, "You seem so preoccupied. It's as if you're constantly searching for something. While I've eaten 4 slices of pizza, you've only had 1. So, once again, you need to tell me what's going on," Owen remarked, gesturing with a slice of pizza. "It's nothing," he answered, feeling foolish. A few nights ago, he had a hallucination that unsettled me. "I thought you were okay with those now," he asked, setting down his slice of pizza. "Yeah, I was. But this one was different," he admitted, resigned to discussing it. "She frightened me." His curiosity now piqued. "Tell me about it." He proceeded to describe the appearance of the tall woman and how she had manifested to him. He made a point of highlighting that she felt more authentic compared to his other hallucinations, particularly due to her unusual and unsettling deformity. While he had encountered smaller versions of people in the past, known as Lilliputian syndrome in medical terms, the presence of an extra appendage and a distorted face was a new and disturbing encounter for him. The combination of these features and her unsettling expectant posture had deeply unsettled him. After he finished recounting the incident, Owen responded, "So you're saying she had beautiful legs?" He playfully responded by throwing his napkin at him while laughing. He then replied in a serious tone, passing the napkin back to him. "No, but seriously, I understand, man. If I walked into a room and saw a giant mutant, it would terrify me too, but you know the cause of your hallucinations. It's similar to the coachman and waterfall you saw. It's a condition you're aware of and know how to manage, right?" Feeling reassured by his words, he nodded and thanked him, acknowledging that he was right. His support had indeed lifted his spirits. To ease the tension, he smiled at him, took a substantial bite of his pizza, and changed the topic, shifting the conversation to inquire about his past relationship with a problematic ex-partner, a subject he eagerly delved into. Nearly a week later, as he stood in front of the mirror, he caught sight of the tall woman again. While brushing his teeth at the wash basin, he unexpectedly caught sight of a figure in the mirror. It was a woman peering from behind the door in the dark hallway. Her face was contorted into the same sinister grin he had seen before, and she wore the dirty bowler hat low over her eyes once more. Strangely, she seemed to be deliberately avoiding being noticed. Shocked, he cried out, spewing toothpaste foam all over the mirror and causing his toothbrush to clatter into the basin. Quickly turning around, his heart raced in his chest and his breath was heavy in his throat. Yet, to his relief, she was nowhere to be found. The doorway stood empty. With cautious steps, he approached the door, carefully peeking into the shadowy hallway without exposing himself fully. Time passed, and still, he could gathering his courage. He finally left the bathroom, only to find the hallway and the rest of his apartment completely vacant. This experience unsettled him greatly, as it was the first time he had witnessed a hallucination in a reflection, and even then, he doubted whether he had truly seen it. As he wrote this now, fully aware of what unfolded later, he realized that his skepticism was a feeble attempt to shield himself from the truth. He was foolish. For 2 weeks, there were no strange incidents, except for a vibrant flash of color that he witnessed on the street outside his apartment, which he had grown accustomed to due to his condition. It was exciting and otherworldly, but not as frightening as the tall woman. Looking back, those 2 weeks were blissful, reminding him of the life he had built for himself after being diagnosed. Life was good. The night everything changed with the tall woman was last night. He had gone out for drinks with friends from our visual impairment group. We had a few beers, but he wasn't drunk. As he walked home with a couple of his friends, laughing and talking, it felt like a great evening. Little did he know it would be his last truly good night. He said goodbye to his friends and clumsily entered his apartment, closing the door a bit too loudly behind him. Taking off his jacket and hanging it on the hook, he flicked the light switch. And there she was, at the end of the hallway. Her 3 hands reached out towards him, her pale face wearing the same malevolent grin. He cursed loudly, jumping back in shock from the impossibly tall and horrifying figure standing in his own home. The tall woman remained motionless, just staring and smiling at him. He stared back, but there was no way he would even consider under his breath. He muttered, "Jesus Christ." You know that feeling of paranoia that can come after a few drinks? That sense of vague dread following alcohol. Well, imagine that feeling coupled with a gigantic, grinning mutant woman suddenly appearing in your house. To say it was uncool would be an understatement. He can't handle this, he sighed, closing his eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5... When he opened his eyes, her face was just a foot away from his, grinning even wider than before. She had sprinted down the hallway and now stood so close to him that her long, reaching arms were on either side of him, her fingers twitching and clawing at the air near his face. He could see her chest heaving, as if she was silently laughing at his futile attempts to dismiss her. It seemed as though the idea of ever being free from her was amusing to her. He let out a full-bodied scream of terror, dropping to his knees and covering his head as if bracing himself for an imminent attack. But the blow never came. Eventually, he let his hands drop and struggled to catch his breath. He scanned the empty hallway, finding no trace of the tall woman. Staying on his knees a while longer, he gasped for air before finally standing up and bolting out of the apartment, out of the building, and onto the street. Standing there, quivering and scared beyond comprehension, he had no idea what his next move would be. After gathering some courage, he retrieved his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. "Hey, Savvy," Owen answered on the other end. "Owen, I need you to come here," he said, his voice choked with sobs. Without questioning or objecting, Owen quickly responded, "I'm on my way." In less than 20 minutes, his car pulled up outside, and he rushed over to the steps where he sat, shivering. He draped his jacket over his shoulders and expressed concern as he asked what had happened. "She's inside." He stuttered, barely able to speak. "The tall woman. She's returned." All right, he reassured, helping him up "Come on, man. Let's go in there and check it out." He wishes he could say that he displayed bravery when we entered, but that would be untrue. He hid behind Owen, his hand gripping his shoulder, as they moved through his residence. Naturally, they found nothing. He meant a gigantic mutant woman in a cramped one-bedroom apartment. Where could she possibly conceal herself? After thoroughly searching every room twice, they eventually had to accept that she had "I'm sorry, man." He apologized sincerely, feeling foolish. "I got scared and I apologize, man." "Hey, don't worry about it, buddy," Owen reassured. "So now that I'm here, where's your stash of alcohol?" After consuming half a bottle of bourbon, they were both feeling quite talkative. She's just different, you know." He attempted to explain. "I understand what you're saying," he said. "It's like you witnessed something disturbing and it has affected you negatively, which is not good." But he didn't truly understand. "No, she's different," he clarified. "I've never experienced a recurring hallucination before, and they've never been frightening. She's unlike the previous ones." "Man," Owen said, as he took another gulp of his bourbon. You have this thing called Charles Bonnet Syndrome, which causes you to see things so. He gestured with his hands, mimicking a magician who had just pulled off a trick. I know, he responded. Listen, Axivi, he said. You understand that it only affects your vision, right? You didn't hear or feel anything. That's how this stuff works. I know it's frightening, but you've been through so much. You're tough, one of the bravest people I know. You can handle a scary hallucination like this. He couldn't help but laugh. She is a creepy hallucination, though, dude. He laughed too, and we both took a sip of our drinks. Do you know, that might help, he said, sounding thoughtful. What drinking? He asked. Well, yes, it does, he chuckled. But I mean, giving her a name could demystify her. Choose something silly so she's not as scary. While I like creepy hallucination, bitch, I have to admit that it's quite a mouthful, he chuckled. I understand, he responded. Suddenly, something he had previously said crossed his mind. What about Helen? He suggested. Helen Highwater. That sounds great, he said, raising his glass. Cheers to Helen, my friend. To Helen! He smiled and finished his drink. Owen ended up spending the night on his couch because he had consumed too much alcohol to even consider driving. But honestly, he thinks he drank so much as an excuse to stay and watch over Xavier. He was glad he did. Knowing he was there made him feel safer and allowed him to get some rest. It provided a sense of security, knowing that if the strange vision he had just named Helen were to reappear, he could rely on him for support. This morning, they both required assistance. I feel like I got hit in the head by a mule. He complained as he entered the living room. Ben's? He asked, his head pounding as well. Ben's, he affirmed, mustering the strength to stand up. Without much conversation, we drank strong black coffee and ate muffins. Finally, Owen broke the silence. So, are you feeling better now? He inquired with a mouthful of blueberry muffin. He nodded. Yeah, I think so. You're not still anxious about you-know-who, right? He asked. Helen, he answered with a smile. No, I genuinely don't think I am. I believe I can handle some eerie hallucination. Good, he chuckled, giving him a friendly pat on the back. That's great, man. I'm sure you can, but now, as he sits here trembling in his bathroom, too frightened to leave his apartment, he realizes they are both mistaken about everything. Earlier, he mentioned how the thought of losing his grip on reality and being institutionalized was the most terrifying thing he could think of. However, he now welcomes that idea because the alternative is much worse. After breakfast, he said goodbye to Owen as he got into his car and drove off. The rest of the day went by without any noteworthy events, and when Sierra stopped by in the afternoon, she even remarked on how cheerful he seemed. She casually asked if he had a special someone in his life, and he couldn't help but laugh at the irony. He replied with a chuckle, saying, yeah, something like that. Her response, telling him to treat this mystery woman well, amused him even further, and he had to bite his lip to hold back his true feelings. He simply replied, sure, I'll do my best. After a tiring evening, he chose to go to bed early tonight. He cleaned his oral hygiene and freshened up before changing into his sleepwear. Finally, he poured a glass of water and made his way to his bedroom. Once he climbed into bed, he immediately felt a tremendous sense of relaxation. In a matter of seconds, he became overwhelmed with a sudden wave of sleepiness that came after a day of fighting off exhaustion. Realizing he couldn't resist it, his heart skipped a beat. He looked towards the end of his bed. There, crouched before me, was the tall woman with her wide grin and an unnerving number of teeth. He felt a shiver down his spine as her long, Slender fingers crept across his blankets, twitching as she tightly clutched the end of his bed. It was a slow and agonizing process, but then her third malformed arm appeared over her shoulder, joining her other hands on his bedding. Fear overtook him, rendering him motionless. He had reached a critical moment, a pivotal juncture that he had been anticipating for some time. However, he had reached his limit. "You no longer have power over me," he declared in a voice full of defiance and rage. "I'm not going to put up with you torturing me anymore." He held out his arm to turn on the light. "Good night, Helen," he said, triumphantly, as he flipped it over and the room became completely dark. Pride consumed him as he lay there, in his warm, comfortable, relishing the emotional victory of conquering his fear. But then it happened. The very thing that brought him to this point was something that sent chills down his spine and turned his insides into jelly. From the depths of the darkness, her raspy voice hissed, "Good night, Xavier."
Brave souls, don't miss out on new horrors lurking in the shadows. Hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for bone-chilling thrills.